Sarah walked into the boardroom and locked the doors behind her. "Excuse me," Richard said, rising from his chair. "This is a private session." "Not anymore," Sarah said. "I own the building you're sitting in." Eleanor laughed, thin and unconvinced. "That's not possible." "It is possible. Julian owns J.E. Trust, the shell company Eleanor called worthless 6 years ago. He has controlled every subsidiary feeding this merger. He has for 6 days already." The color drained from Eleanor's face, gray cold, the shade of old concrete. Marcus edged toward the door, testing the handle. Julian stood at the head of the table. He didn't need to raise his voice. He had already won this weeks before she ever handed him that box.
Nobody expected this. She threw away her devoted partner, completely oblivious that cardboard box conceals her destruction. Let's begin.
Silence pressed against the glass walls of the lobby. 41 years old Julian Hale stood at his own desk with a cardboard box in his hands. Cheap, thin, already sagging at one corner. His knuckles had gone white around the edges. 31 employees watched from the mezzanine. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Eleanor crossed the marble floor in heels that clicked like a metronome counting down. 39 years old, sharp-jawed, dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than Julian's first year of rent. A glass of champagne sat balanced in her fingers, untouched, catching the fluorescent light. "You're fired, Julian," she said. Flat, rehearsed. "And I want a divorce." She set a folder on the desk between them, papers already signed on her side. The scent of stale coffee and old wiring drifted from the break room down the hall, mixing with her perfume rose, and something colder underneath. Julian did not answer right away. He looked at the folder. He looked at her. He said nothing. Marcus leaned against the executive elevator, 34 smug arms crossed, watching the scene like it was entertainment built just for him. 2 security guards flanked Eleanor, patient board, used to this kind of theater. "Nothing to say?" Eleanor asked. Her voice carried pitched for the mezzanine. "That's very you." Moses stood behind the security desk. 58 years old, deep lines carved into a face that had seen this building rise from nothing. A faded photo of his granddaughter was taped inside his badge holder, soft at the corners from years of handling. He gripped the edge of the desk. He said nothing. Fear not indifference kept him quiet. Julian reached into the box. He moved a stapler. He moved a stack of folders. Underneath, wrapped in a torn cloth, sat a small red flash drive. His fingers found it without looking. He slid it into his coat pocket in one motion, smooth, practiced, invisible to everyone but him. Nobody saw. Nobody except Moses, whose eyes flicked down, then away fast. "There's one more thing," Julian said. His voice stayed even, quiet, controlled. "The subsidiary, J.E. Trust. Leave it out of the filings." Eleanor almost laughed. "That shell company, it's worth nothing, Julian. It hasn't turned a profit in 6 years. "Then it cost you nothing to leave it alone," he said. She waved a hand dismissive, already bored of the request. "Fine. Keep your worthless little trust. I have a company to run." She lifted the champagne glass. She drank. Her eyes did not leave his face, waiting for the crack. The plea, the collapse she believed was coming. It never came. "This is necessary, Julian," she said. And there it was again. That word she used like a shield, the same word she'd used the day she pushed his name off the founding papers, the same word she'd use in the boardroom at the gala, in every room where she needed cruelty to sound clean. "You have to understand. The board needs a clear vision. I can't have dead weight holding the company back." Dead weight. 10 years, 1 marriage, reduced to 2 words and a cardboard box. Julian tucked the folder under his arm. He picked up the box. He walked toward the door, past the guards, past Marcus, past 31 silent employees who would not meet his eyes. At the door he paused. He turned back once. "Good luck with the merger," he said. Quiet, level, almost kind. Eleanor smiled victorious, sipping her champagne like she'd already won a war nobody else knew was being fought. She had no idea a war existed at all. Rain hit the windows outside hard, steady, indifferent to the wreckage inside. Julian stepped into it without an umbrella. The box grew damp in his arms within seconds. He did not seem to notice. He did not seem to care. Moses watched him go. His jaw tightened. His hands folded on the desk did not move for a long time after the doors closed. Behind him in the corner office 30 floors up, Eleanor set down her glass and laughed once, sharp, satisfied, already reaching for her phone to tell Marcus the news. She believed the box was his ending. She had no idea what was coming. 12 years earlier, Julian worked the mailroom at Sterling Financial, 29 years old, sorting envelopes for $11.50 an hour. His shoes had a hole starting in the left sole. He never mentioned it to anyone. Eleanor was 27, then brilliant, restless, sketching a startup on napkins in a diner that smelled like burnt coffee and old grease. She had the idea. She did not have the money. Julian gave her both. He worked the mailroom by day. He worked as a delivery driver by night, 4 hours of sleep, sometimes 3. $340 a week went into a joint account. Every dollar of it funded servers, software licenses, a single rented desk, and a shared office with a flickering light that buzzed above their heads. Eleanor never touched the mailroom job. She never touched the delivery van. She built the pitch decks. She took the meetings. Julian stood behind her in every one of them, silent, present, invisible. "We should put it all in my name," Eleanor said. One-night papers spread across their kitchen table, a single lamp casting long shadows against the wall. "For tax purposes, it's cleaner that way." Julian looked up from the ledger he'd been keeping by hand. "Cleaner how?" he asked. "Investors like a single founder," she said, smooth, practiced even then. "One name, one face, one story they can believe in." He didn't argue. He never argued with her, not back then, not when believing in her felt like the only thing he had left after giving up his own ambitions to build hers. "Fine," he said. "Put it in your name." She smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind she hadn't worn in years by the time the divorce papers came. She kissed him once, quick, grateful. Neither of them knew that kiss would be the last honest thing between them for a decade. Somewhere in a locked drawer, a founding charter sat waiting. Buried beneath tax documents and vendor contracts, one signature line carried 2 names instead of one faded. Now easy to miss unless someone knew exactly where to look. Julian knew exactly where to look. He had drafted the charter himself, 3 a.m, cross-legged on their apartment floor, a legal template downloaded from a forum, and a legal pad full of notes borrowed from a night class he'd taken in secret. Eleanor never read it past the first page. She signed where he told her to sign. She never asked why a secondary line existed at all. That secondary line was his name. Small, quiet, legal. The company grew. $40,000 in seed funding became $2 million in Series A. Eleanor's face went on magazine covers. Analysts called her a visionary, a disruptor, a self-made force of nature. Nobody asked who funded the servers in year 1. Nobody asked whose credit score had been destroyed, covering the difference between payroll and revenue for 11 straight months. Julian never corrected the story. He never needed the credit. He needed the company to survive, and it did, and that was enough for him back then, before he understood what survival would cost him. By year 3, Eleanor stopped introducing him as her partner. She introduced him as her husband, a smaller word, softer, easier to leave out of press releases altogether. By year 5, she stopped introducing him at all. He noticed. He said nothing. His silence was not weakness. It was patience, the kind that takes root slowly and grows in the dark, where nobody thinks to look for it. Eleanor believed she had built an empire alone. Marble floors. A corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows. A name recognized in every boardroom on the East Coast. She believed every brick of it was hers, poured from her own hands, earned by her own genius. She never once thought to check whose name sat quietly beside hers on a charter locked away in a drawer she'd forgotten existed. She never thought to ask why Julian, a man with no formal title, no public credit, no visible stake, never once demanded more. The answer was simple. He didn't need to demand anything. He already owned it. If you've ever built something for someone who forgot your name the moment it stopped needing you, you already know exactly how this feels. Eleanor is about to learn the most expensive lesson of her life, and she doesn't even know class is in session. Julian's apartment smelled different when he opened the door. Cologne expensive foreign to the space. Not his. He stood in the doorway for exactly 4 seconds before he understood. Marcus stood in the bedroom, 34 years old, shirtless, pulling one of Julian's dress shirts off a hanger like it belonged to him already. Blue cotton, a small coffee stain on the left cuff Julian had never bothered to fix. "Didn't think you'd show up," Marcus said. He didn't turn around. He buttoned the shirt slowly, watching himself in the mirror instead of watching Julian. "Eleanor said you'd probably crawl back to whatever hole you came from." Julian said nothing. He set his cardboard box down by the door. Rain still clung to the corners of it, soaking through the bottom seam. Claire stood near the kitchen counter, 26 years old, a tablet clutched against her chest, a lanyard with Eleanor's company badge swinging from her neck. She chewed the end of a pen she wasn't using, a habit she'd had since business school. Her eyes darted from Marcus to Julian and back again, quick, uneasy, unwilling to land anywhere for long. "Mr. Hale," she said. Quiet. Careful. "Ms. Vance asked me to update the household accounts. I didn't know you'd be—" "It's fine, Claire," Julian said. It wasn't fine. Nobody in the room believed it was fine, but his voice stayed even low, unreadable, and that unsettled her more than shouting would have. Marcus finished buttoning the shirt. He rolled the sleeves once, twice the exact way Julian used to roll them. He walked past Julian into the living room like he owned the floor beneath his feet, like the apartment had always belonged to him, and Julian was the guest. "Nice place," Marcus said. "A little small for someone with Eleanor's taste. We're renovating, obviously. New floors, new everything." Julian looked at the shirt Marcus wore. He looked at the coffee stain. He said nothing. 14 months. That was how long Marcus had worked at Eleanor's company before this. 14 months to go from junior analyst to living in another man's apartment, wearing another man's clothes, sleeping in another man's bed. Claire's tablet buzzed. She glanced down at it, then quickly away, guilty, like she'd been caught reading something she shouldn't have. "Everything all right, Claire?" Julian asked. "Fine," she said too fast. Just, stock alerts. Ms. Vance has me monitoring the merger paperwork." Julian's jaw tightened, just barely, a flicker most people would have missed entirely. He walked to the small desk in the corner of the room, the one Marcus hadn't bothered to touch, yet too plain, too cheap to interest him. Underneath it sat an old laptop, scratched, dented at one corner, the kind of machine nobody would ever suspect held anything of value. He opened it. He typed 11 characters. A dashboard filled the screen, quiet gray, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. Stock movements, debt positions. 3 companies flagged in red, their ownership structures shifting in small, careful increments nobody at Eleanor's company had noticed yet. Marcus wandered past, glancing at the screen without interest. "Job hunting?" he asked. He laughed short, ugly. "Bit late for that, isn't it?" Julian closed the laptop. "Something like that," he said. Marcus dropped onto the couch. Julian's couch, arms spread wide across the back of it, utterly at ease, utterly certain of his place in the world. "You should see the new office they're giving me," Marcus said. "Corner spot, Eleanor's orders. Guess loyalty finally pays off around here." Loyalty. Julian filed the word away, quiet, patient, the way he filed everything now. Claire lingered by the door, unwilling to leave, unwilling to stay caught between 2 men and a company that had started to feel less stable than the numbers suggested it should. "Mr. Hale," she said softly when Marcus finally wandered into the bedroom to admire himself further. "Is everything okay with the company, I mean? The numbers you were just looking at, they didn't look right." Julian looked at her for a long moment. 26 years old. Knew enough not to be corrupted yet. Scared enough to still be honest. "Keep doing your job, Claire," he said, "and keep your eyes open." She nodded, uncertain, and gathered her things. Julian picked his box back up. He walked to the door. He did not look at the bedroom where Marcus stood adjusting a shirt that used to be his. Outside, the rain had stopped. The street smelled like wet pavement and exhaust. A single delivery truck idled at the curb, its engine ticking as it cooled. Marcus believed he'd won a home, a woman, a life that used to belong to someone weaker than him. He had no idea he was living inside someone else's trap, counting down days he didn't know were numbered. The boardroom smelled like burnt coffee and printer toner 12 hours old, thick enough to cling to the back of the throat. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a low electric hum that never quite stopped. Richard Ashworth sat at the head of the table, 62 years old, silver-haired, a gold signet ring turning slowly on his right hand as he flipped through a folder marked confidential. 23 years on this board. 23 years of voting exactly the way Power told him to vote. Eleanor sat beside him, composed a folder of her own, open in front of her, untouched champagne sweating in a glass near her elbow. "Bring him in," Richard said. Two junior associates escorted Julian to a chair at the far end of the table. No coffee offered. No water. 9 board members watched him sit silent, still unreadable. "Mr. Hale," Richard began, folding his hands. "We've reviewed the terms of your separation from the company. There's a matter of your remaining stock options." 211,000 shares, Eleanor said, flat, precise. "Vested 3 years ago. Under a clause in Section 14, Richard continued, options granted during a marriage may be reclassified as marital property upon divorce filing. Effective immediately, your shares transfer into a holding account pending settlement." Julian said nothing. "It's necessary," Eleanor said. That word again. Smooth, clean. Practiced like a blade kept sharp through repetition. A legal notice slid across the table toward Julian, crisp, official. A red stamp across the header. He picked it up. He read it once. He did not read it twice. He folded it in half. He folded it again. He walked it to the shredder in the corner of the room, the machine's low, grinding whir, the only sound left in the boardroom, and fed it through page by page without a word. 9 board members exchanged glances. Richard's jaw tightened, faint, almost imperceptible. "That was an official document, Mr. Hale," Richard said. "So is this," Julian said. He pulled his phone from his coat pocket. He typed 11 digits, sent a single message, and returned the phone to his pocket before anyone at the table could read the screen. "Who was that?" Eleanor asked. Her voice carried an edge, now thin, brittle at the corners. "Someone who will be very interested in today's minutes," Julian said. Richard cleared his throat, redirecting. "This board has a fiduciary responsibility to protect company assets during executive transitions. Your continued presence on the cap table represents unnecessary risk." "Unnecessary," Julian repeated. Quiet. Even. "The board recognizes Eleanor Vance as sole controlling shareholder." Richard said, "Effective upon ratification of this resolution." A vote was called. 9 hands rose around the table, one after another, without hesitation, without a single question asked about the man sitting silently at the far end. Eleanor smiled, small, satisfied, the kind of smile reserved for people who believe the outcome was never in doubt. "All in favor," Richard said. "The board formally strips Julian Hale's remaining equity and transfers full operational control to Eleanor Vance pending finalization of the merger." 9 votes. 0 dissent. 1 silence heavier than anything spoken in the room that day. Julian stood. "Congratulations," he said. Level, almost gentle. Eleanor's smile faltered for half a second, uncertain why victory didn't taste the way she expected it to. "You're free to go, Mr. Hale," Richard said, already turning back to his folder, already moving on to the next item on the agenda, dismissing Julian the way a man dismisses something already handled. Julian walked out. He did not look back. In the hallway, Claire stood near the elevator bank, tablet in hand, eyes wide with something she didn't have words for yet. "They took everything," she said quietly as he passed. "They think they did," Julian said. Behind the boardroom doors, Richard poured himself a glass of water, satisfied, unaware that his signature on today's resolution had just become the first piece of evidence in a case that hadn't been filed yet. Eleanor lifted her champagne glass in a private toast to nobody, congratulating herself on a war she believed had already ended. 31 floors below, a black car idled at the curb, engine running, waiting for a call that hadn't come yet from a woman neither Eleanor nor Richard had ever heard of. They believed the board had settled everything. They had no idea the real verdict hadn't even started. The Ashford Grand Ballroom smelled of fresh roses and old money, 300 guests moving beneath crystal chandeliers, champagne flutes, clinking like a soundtrack nobody had written down. A string quartet played somewhere near the back, soft unbothered by the cruelty unfolding 20 feet away. Eleanor stood at the center of it all, radiant in emerald silk champagne flute raised toward a crowd of investors and board members celebrating the merger she believed was already hers. "A toast," she said, voice carrying easily across the room, "to vision, to growth, to leaving the past exactly where it belongs." Applause rippled through the crowd. Marcus stood beside her, 34, tailored in a suit that cost more than Julian had ever spent on clothing in a single year. Julian stood near the service entrance, a tray balanced in his hands, wearing a black uniform vest 2 sizes too large. Eleanor's request, delivered through Claire that morning, framed as a joke nobody found funny except the 2 people who'd suggested it. "There he is," Marcus said loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Our old friend Julian, still finding ways to be useful, I see." Laughter scattered, uncomfortable from people who didn't know whether it was safe to laugh. Julian said nothing. He carried the tray forward, offered champagne to a cluster of investors, and moved on without breaking stride. Moses stood near the perimeter, 58 years old, hired for the evening, as extra security hands clenched at his sides tight enough to whiten his knuckles. He watched Julian move through the crowd, silent, dignified, degraded, and said nothing because saying something would cost him a job he needed and a daughter's tuition he couldn't afford to lose. "Champagne, Julian," Eleanor called out, snapping her fingers once, casual, careless, the way someone calls a dog rather than a person. "Table 6 needs a refill." Julian crossed the room. He filled 6 glasses without spilling a drop. He did not look at Eleanor's face while he did it. "You used to run this company," one investor said quietly, almost apologetic as Julian poured his glass. "Did I?" Julian said, flat, unreadable. Eleanor watched from across the room, drink in hand, delighted by the spectacle she'd engineered, unaware that delight this loud always leaves a mark somewhere. Marcus leaned toward a group of junior executives, gesturing toward Julian with his glass. 10 years married to her, and this is where he ends up. Serving drinks at his own farewell party. Some men just aren't built for the top. More laughter. Louder this time. Confident. Julian set his tray down near table 6, adjusted the stack of napkins, and let his hands slide beneath the tablecloth for exactly 2 seconds. Small. Quiet. A device no larger than a coin pressed flat against the underside of the table where nobody would think to look. Nobody saw. Nobody except Moses, whose eyes tracked the movement and then flicked away, fast practiced now at seeing nothing. Eleanor raised her glass again, this time toward Marcus, laughing at something he'd whispered near her ear. Champagne spilled slightly over the rim, catching the chandelier light as it fell. "To new beginnings," she said. The quartet shifted into something slower, sweeter, entirely wrong for the moment unfolding beneath it. Julian returned to the service entrance. He set his tray down. He stood hands folded, waiting for the next request, the next small cruelty, the next glass someone would ask him to fill. Moses approached the water station near him, refilling ice without needing to. "You don't have to take this," Moses said quietly, barely above a whisper. "I know," Julian said. "Then why?" Julian looked toward table 6, toward the small device pressed invisibly beneath it toward Eleanor, laughing loud enough to be heard across the entire ballroom. "Because she's about to say something she shouldn't," Julian said. Moses studied his face for a long moment. He didn't understand yet. He would soon enough. Across the room, Eleanor pulled Richard aside, glass in hand, voice dropping into the careless register reserved for people who believe nobody important is listening. Marcus laughed at something near her, oblivious. Investors mingled, oblivious. 300 guests toasted a merger built on paperwork none of them had actually read closely enough. Julian watched Eleanor's lips move near table 6, catching fragments, confirming what he already suspected. He said nothing. He simply waited patient, the way water waits behind a dam nobody has checked in years. Eleanor finished her champagne. She set the empty glass down exactly where the tablecloth met the small device beneath it, close enough now that every word from this point forward would travel somewhere she couldn't imagine. She believed tonight was her coronation. She had no idea it was already being recorded.
Pure, unadulterated disrespect. Eleanor literally forced her husband to serve champagne to her new lover at a corporate gala. If that were me, the table would have been flipped immediately. Imagine having the sheer audacity to humiliate the man who built your company in front of everyone. Keep watching.
Sarah Whitfield arrived in the city on a Tuesday, 44 years old, dressed in charcoal wool, carrying nothing but a slim leather case and a phone that never seemed to stop buzzing quietly against her hip. She checked into a hotel under a name that wasn't hers, requested a room on the 14th floor, and asked for nothing else. She worked from a corner suite for 6 days straight, curtains drawn, 3 monitors glowing in the dim light, tracking debt positions across 4 subsidiary companies tied to Eleanor's merger partners. $340 million in outstanding obligations scattered across 11 creditors, most of them small enough to sell quietly if someone approached at the right price. Sarah approached all 11. By the end of the 6th day, she controlled 61 of the debt-keeping Eleanor's merger partners solvent. Quiet. Legal, invisible to anyone not looking directly for it. Claire noticed first, 26 years old, buried in paperwork at her desk near Eleanor's office, 3 coffee cups gone cold beside her keyboard. The merger documents she'd been asked to file kept returning with errors, mismatched signatures, creditor names that shifted slightly between drafts. "Ms. Vance," Claire said, knocking softly on the open door. "Something's wrong with the acquisition paperwork. The debt structure doesn't match what legal sent last week." Eleanor didn't look up from her screen. "Fix it, Claire. I don't have time for clerical errors today." "It's not clerical," Claire said. 3 of the creditor names have changed ownership in the last week. I don't recognize the new entities." "Then find out who they are and move on," Eleanor said, dismissive, already reaching for her phone. Claire hesitated in the doorway, unsettled by something she couldn't name yet, before retreating quietly back to her desk. Julian worked from the small apartment he'd moved into after the divorce filing laptop opened 3 windows, tracking creditor movements in real time. He watched the numbers shift, methodical, patient, each acquisition landing exactly where Sarah had promised it would. His phone buzzed once, a single message. 6 words. "Structure complete. Ready when you are." He typed back 2 words. "Send it." Across town, Sarah opened her leather case and removed a single folder, thick official stamped with the seal of a holding entity most people in this city had never heard of. J.E. Trust. Buried for years as a worthless subsidiary, worth nothing on paper, worth everything in practice. She walked into the county clerk's office at 9:14 in the morning and filed formal hostile takeover authorization documents against the parent company overseeing Eleanor's merger partners, listing J.E. Trust as the acquiring entity. The clerk stamped the paperwork without a second glance. Nobody in that office recognized the name. Nobody would for a while longer. Eleanor signed the preliminary merger agreement that same afternoon, unaware, satisfied, believing the final piece of her empire had finally clicked into place. "This makes it official," Richard said, sliding the signed pages across his desk toward a waiting courier. "The board will be thrilled." "They should be," Eleanor said. "I built this from nothing." Richard smiled, the kind of smile old money gives when it believes a transaction has gone exactly as planned. Neither of them noticed the small line at the bottom of page 4, the acquiring party listed in text small enough to ignore 4 letters and an ampersand nobody bothered to research. J.E. Trust. Claire noticed it 2 hours later, alone at her desk, scrolling through the finalized documents one last time before archiving them. Her finger froze over the screen. J.E. Julian. Eleanor. Her coffee went cold in her hand. She didn't say anything to anyone. She simply sat there staring at 4 letters that suddenly meant something entirely different than she'd assumed for the past several weeks. That evening, Sarah called Julian from the 14th floor. City lights spread out beneath her window like scattered embers. "She signed it," Sarah said. "Every clause, every page." "Good," Julian said. "She still has no idea who's on the other side of this." "She will," Julian said. "Soon enough." Sarah allowed herself a small, tight smile, the kind reserved for people who've spent 6 days building a trap nobody else could see. "You know this makes you her boss now, technically." "Not yet," Julian said. "Let her enjoy the illusion a little longer." Outside Sarah's window, the city hummed on, indifferent, unaware that somewhere in its financial architecture, a name buried for years had just quietly reclaimed everything it was owed. Eleanor believed she'd closed the deal of her career. She had no idea she'd just handed her empire directly to the man she threw away. The boardroom felt smaller than Julian remembered, the air thick with stale coffee, and something sharper underneath expensive cologne turned sour with nerves that weren't his. 2 associates walked him in without touching him, though Richard's eyes tracked the empty space around Julian like a warden inspecting a cell. Eleanor sat at the head of the table now, a title that used to feel earned. Today it felt heavier. She didn't know why. "Let's not drag this out," Richard said, sliding a single document across the table. Thick official, a red tab marking the signature line. "A zero severance non-disclosure agreement. Sign it and this ends quietly. Refuse and the board pursues personal bankruptcy proceedings against you for outstanding legal costs." Julian looked at the paper. He did not touch it. "You built nothing here," Eleanor said. Her voice had an edge to it now, thinner than before, a crack running beneath the polish. "You rode my success for a decade and called it marriage." 9 board members said nothing, watching, waiting, complicit in their silence. "Sign it," Richard said, "or lose everything you have left." Julian picked up the pen. Somewhere behind his ribs, something pulled tight, a doubt he hadn't let himself feel until this exact second. 12 years. 1 ledger kept by hand at 3 in the morning. 1 signature buried in a drawer nobody remembered to check. What if none of it mattered? What if patience was just another word for cowardice dressed up to look like strategy? He almost believed it. Eleanor watched him lower the pen toward the page, and something in her chest loosened, victorious, certain the war finally over. Exactly the way she'd always assumed it would end. "This whole process has been so unnecessary," Eleanor said, laughing, once short, sharp. "You could have just accepted this from the start, but you always needed to make things difficult, didn't you? Always needed to prove some point nobody asked you to prove." Richard leaned back, satisfied. "The board thanks you for your cooperation, Mr. Hale." Julian's pen touched the page. 9 sets of eyes fixed on that single point of contact, hungry, expectant, already composing the story they'd tell afterward about the day Julian Hale finally broke. Somewhere in his coat pocket, a phone buzzed once. Silent. He didn't reach for it. The pen pressed down. Eleanor smiled. Marcus, watching from the corner of the room, mouthed something victorious at nobody in particular. Julian's hand did not move further. He lifted the pen away from the page, untouched, the signature line still empty, and set it down flat against the table. The room went still. "Something wrong, Mr. Hale?" Richard asked, irritation flickering through his composure for the first time. "Just making sure," Julian said. "Quiet. Level. I want to sign the right thing." Eleanor's smile faltered, small, brief, gone almost as fast as it appeared. "It's the only thing on the table." "I know," Julian said. He looked at Richard. He looked at Eleanor. He looked briefly at the small red light blinking beneath the edge of the conference table, a device most people in the room didn't know existed, recording every word spoken here since the meeting began. "This is necessary," Eleanor said. Again, that word worn smooth from overuse. The same word she'd used the night she erased his name from a founding charter. The same word about to cost her everything. Julian said nothing. He thought of Moses standing near the water station at the gala, silent watching. He thought of Claire's face when she first noticed 4 letters on a signature line. He thought of a ledger kept in the dark, 12 years old, never once acknowledged. Patience did not feel like cowardice anymore. It felt like the last quiet breath before something enormous finally arrived. "Sign it," Richard said, sharper now than waiting. Julian picked the pen back up. Nobody in that room understood what was about to happen. Not Richard adjusting his cufflinks with the calm of a man who believed the outcome was already settled. Not Eleanor lifting her champagne glass in premature celebration. Not Marcus grinning from the corner like a man who'd already won a war he never actually fought. Julian lowered the pen toward the signature line one final time. They believed this was his surrender. They had no idea it was already too late for any of them. The boardroom doors swung open before Julian's pen touched paper. 9 heads turned at once. Sarah Whitfield walked in 44, unhurried, a black folder pressed against her side like a weapon she'd been waiting years to draw. She crossed the room in 11 steps, heels striking the floor in a rhythm that sounded almost like a countdown. She reached the doors behind her. She turned the lock. "Excuse me," Richard said, rising halfway from his chair. "This is a private board session." "Not anymore," Sarah said. Eleanor's composure cracked at the edges. "Who let her in here?" "Nobody had to let me in," Sarah said. "I own the building you're sitting in." Silence dropped over the room, heavy, immediate, the kind that presses against the chest. Sarah opened the folder. She slid a stack of documents across the table, past Richard, past Eleanor, until they landed directly in front of Julian's untouched pen. "Hostile acquisition finalized 6 days ago," Sarah said. "J.E. Trust now holds controlling interest in every entity tied to this merger, including this company." Eleanor's laugh came out thin, unconvinced. "G Trust is a dead shell. It hasn't turned a profit in 6 years." "It didn't need to turn a profit," Sarah said. "It needed to survive long enough for the right person to activate it." Richard reached for the documents, scanning quickly, his fingers tightening around the edges of the page. "This is impossible. The trust has no listed executive, no public officer." "It has one," Sarah said. She looked at Julian. 9 sets of eyes followed her gaze, slow, disbelieving, landing on the man they'd spent the last hour trying to break. "Julian Hale," Sarah said, "Chief Executive Officer, J.E. Trust Holdings, controlling shareholder as of this morning across 4 subsidiaries feeding directly into this merger." The color drained from Eleanor's face like someone had pulled a plug beneath her skin. Gray. Cold. The exact shade of old concrete. "That's not possible," she said. Barely a whisper. "It's very possible," Julian said. Quiet. Even. The same voice he'd used for 10 years while she never once thought to listen closely. Marcus stood near this corner, his mouth slightly open, the smugness draining out of him in real time. Richard's hands had gone still on the table, the gold signet ring no longer turning. "You," Eleanor said. "You did this." "I built this," Julian said, 12 years ago, in a mailroom you never once visited." Eleanor's eyes darted to the folder, then to Julian, then back to the folder, searching for an error, a loophole, anything that might undo what was sitting directly in front of her. There wasn't one. "The founding charter," Julian said. 2 names on the signature line. You only ever read the first one." Silence again this time. Longer, heavier, nobody in the room willing to break it first. "This is necessary," Julian said. He let the word sit there exactly as long as she'd let it sit every time she'd used it against him before continuing. "Necessary the way it was necessary to erase my name from a company I built. Necessary. The way it was necessary to hand my apartment to another man. Necessary the way it was necessary to make me serve champagne at my own farewell party." Eleanor said nothing. There was nothing left to say. "The board's resolution stripping my equity," Julian continued, "was recorded. Every vote, every signature. Section 14 doesn't apply to shares held through a trust structure predating the marriage. Your legal team missed that, or ignored it." Richard's jaw tightened. He said nothing, understanding now exactly how deep the exposure ran. "You can't do this," Eleanor said finally, voice cracking somewhere in the middle of the sentence. "The board voted. Unanimously. The board voted to strip equity I never actually held under their jurisdiction," Julian said. They voted to celebrate a merger built entirely on debt I own. Every signature in this room today just confirmed it publicly on record. Marcus edged toward the door, quiet testing whether anyone would stop him. Sarah didn't move. She didn't need to. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly against the table, the first crack in 10 years of flawless composure. "Why?" she said. "Why let it go this far? The gala, the severance meeting. Why not just tell me?" Julian looked at her for a long moment. "Because you needed to say it yourself," he said. "Every word, on the record, necessary." Eleanor's champagne glass sat forgotten near her elbow, untouched for the first time all week. Richard finally spoke, quiet, resigned. "What happens now, Mr. Hale?" Julian stood. "Now," he said, "we discuss what necessary really means." 9 board members sat frozen, the weight of the room shifting visibly from one end of the table to the other, power draining out of Eleanor's chair and settling somewhere it had always secretly belonged. Eleanor believed she still had time to fix this. She had no idea the verdict had already been recorded word for word 6 days ago. Julian stood at the head of the boardroom table, the same table where he'd once been handed a folder and a box. Today the room belonged to him, though he wore the same worn coat he'd worn the day he left it. "Sarah," he said, "proceed." Sarah opened her folder. "Effective immediately, all personal and corporate assets held under Eleanor Vance are frozen pending liquidation. Full board dissolution, effective end of business today." Eleanor rose from her chair, knuckles white against the table's edge. "You can't do this. I built this company from nothing." "You built it from $340 a week and a mailroom salary you never once acknowledged," Julian said. Flat. Final. "Please," Eleanor said. Her voice cracked thin, unrecognizable from the woman who'd handed him divorce papers 3 weeks ago. "Julian, 10 years. That has to count for something." Julian looked at her. He said nothing for a long moment. "It counted," he said. "For 10 years. I stopped counting the day you called me deadweight." Marcus edged toward the door, quiet, careful, testing the handle. "Marcus," Julian said without turning. "Leaving already?" Marcus froze. "This has nothing to do with me." "It has everything to do with you," Julian said. 14 months in my apartment, my clothes, my life. Consider your employment terminated, effective immediately, no severance, no exceptions." Marcus's face went pale gray, the color of old concrete. He said nothing further. He pulled the door open and disappeared into the hallway without looking back once, without looking at Eleanor at all. She watched him go. Something in her chest seemed to fold inward, quiet, collapsing. "Marcus?" she said, weak, disbelieving. "Marcus, wait." He didn't. Richard remained seated, hands folded, resigned to whatever came next. "In the board, Mr. Hale." "Dissolved," Julian said. "Every member, effective today. Severance calculated at 0 per the standard you all voted to apply to me 3 weeks ago." Nobody at the table argued. Nobody had grounds left to stand on. Moses stood near the door, 58 years old, watching Eleanor's composure finally break in full tears streaking down a face that had spent a decade perfecting cruelty. His jaw, clenched for weeks, finally loosened. Something like relief moved through him, quiet, heavy-earned. "Please," Eleanor said again, turning to Julian directly now, voice raw. "I'll do anything. Keep my job. Keep something. Anything." Julian reached into his coat pocket. He removed the same folder she'd once slid across a desk toward him, worn now at the corners, carried for 3 weeks, in a coat that had seen rain, humiliation, and quiet victory in equal measure. "You said this was necessary," he said. "You were right." He set the folder down in front of her, closed. "Sarah will finalize the liquidation," Julian said. "Every asset, every account. The apartment goes first." Eleanor's hands shook against the table. She said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Security arrived at the door. 2 guards, patient, the same posture Eleanor's own guards had worn 3 weeks earlier in the lobby downstairs. "Ms. Vance," one of them said. We need to escort you from the building. Eleanor rose slowly unsteady, the woman who'd once crossed marble floors like she owned every inch of them, now barely able to stand upright. She looked at Julian one final time. "Why didn't you just tell me?" she said. "Why let it get this far?" "You never asked," Julian said. "Not once in 10 years did you ever ask what I was building. You just assumed there was nothing there." The guards led her toward the elevator past the mezzanine where 31 employees had once watched Julian carry a cardboard box out into the rain. Today they watched Eleanor make the same walk, escorted, stripped, silent. Moses followed at a distance, watching her go, his eyes wet, his hands finally still. Julian remained in the boardroom alone with Sarah and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights overhead. "It's done," Sarah said. "It's done," Julian agreed. He walked to the window. Rain had started again outside, soft, steady, familiar. He thought of a mailroom, a ledger kept at 3 in the morning, a cardboard box soaked through in 20 minutes of walking without an umbrella. He thought of a word she'd used like a shield for 10 years. Necessary. He finally understood what it had always meant. It meant exactly what he needed it to mean the moment he needed it most. Downstairs, Eleanor stepped out into the same rain that had once soaked through Julian's box. No umbrella offered, no car waiting, nobody left standing beside her at all. She had once believed silence was weakness. She had no idea it had been the loudest thing in the room the whole time. What drives a person to such blinding arrogance? This story is a work of fiction, but Eleanor's downfall feels incredibly real. We've all encountered someone who mistook kindness for weakness and loyalty for stupidity. Have you ever had to teach an arrogant person a painful lesson in humility? Drop your story in the comments below and hit that subscribe button to catch our next satisfying revenge saga.